My title is Could Xenophobia and New Nationalism be justified by appealing to the preservation of cultural identity? It could be said that prima facie xenophobia means an aversion to foreigners and strangers, aversion to those who are not from our region, our country, our state, but they come here and they stay here. They have their own customs, beliefs, and manners that are different, unusual, and strange. The before mentioned prima facie definition of xenophobia is so general that for the reasons to be presented here, we could say that it is a half-truth. It is even worse to refer only to the etymological determination, a state that it is the fear of foreigners and strangers. Whether we call the aversion to foreigners xenophobia, it depends on what type of aversion it is and which foreigners they are. It depends on the power relations. They are often crucial when foreigners should accept our cultural patterns and determine the extent to which they are ready to accept them. A group of medieval traveling entertainers usually had its distinctive features in relation to the native population, but it would not insist on its cultural superiority in the places whose inhabitants they considered less polite and perhaps even barbaric. They wanted to be well received and accepted. On the contrary, conquerors always emphasized their superiority. European colonizers used to justify their colonization of the conquered territories and nations, but by claiming their cultural superiority. They civilized these barbarians. They tried to provide eternal life for them. They taught them. Of course, the colonizers kept their customs. This was the case during the British rule of the Indian subcontinent. It was later, and rather infrequently, that few British and Western people came to India to seek guidance for spiritual salvation from the Indian gurus. Even today, such individuals often accept local cultural patterns. Namely, despite the scientific and technological superiority of the society they came from, they have lost confidence in its cultural values. Because they trust the spiritual superiority of the Hindu religious systems, they are prone to demonstrate enthusiasm to accept almost all cultural practice of the environment whose religion they accept, starting from the diet and the dressing and so on. Or at least they do not despise or scorn these practices. Lack of respect for the subordinated culture by the colonial authorities is almost an official position, and it is always common and standard, as are common the two main types of reaction among subordinated cultures. Some of them attempt to get closer to new masters and gain some respect, but by taking on certain aspects of the cultural patterns of the colonizers. Others, in their struggle to preserve or regain some self-esteem, demonstrate defensive nationalism, which strives to affirm and elevate everything that is one's own and traditional. Contrary to the messianic nationalism of the colonizers, defensive nationalism of the colonized emerges, which eventually may also take on some features of the messianic nationalism. When Swami Vivekananda, at the end of the 19th and the early 20th century in England and America, during one of his Hindu counter missionary, held a lecture on Vedanta and yoga, emphasizing the universal aspects of this teaching and these practices, he demonstrated that he believed in their messianic character for the whole human race. Apart from the messianic nationalism, which has the ambition to provide a cultural pattern for the whole of humanity, the defensive nationalism of small nations can get microcolonial forms, not by colonizing distant overseas countries, but neighboring territories. As a result, this creates among the domicile population of these territories their own defensive nationalism. These types of nationalism always end in oppression of their own minority groups that do not fit into the ideal of religious or ethnic homogeneity, no matter whether their origin is in the narrative of religious or ethnic homogeneity. The Balkan nationalism and civil wars on the territory of the former Yugoslavia demonstrate the violent potential of defensive nationalisms. Liberation from the oppression of former colonizers leads to liberation of the potential for mutual oppression of social groups. This gives the opportunity to former oppressors, rejected empires, for the subsequent cynical rejoicing such as they were better off when they were under our rule. As if the former oppressors had nothing to do with the violence that arose after they were forced to leave power. The term nationalism could denote any form of preferences of members of one's own ethnic or cultural group. That is, members of one's own nation state in relation to membership of other ethnic and cultural groups or citizens of other nation states. It is clear that this definition is too wide. For example, in the case of nation states, it largely coincides with the notion of patriotism. One of the differences is that the term patriotism generally implies affirmative and commendable meanings. Most citizens of any state would identify themselves as patriots in the usual circumstances. Exception from this can be found in those cases when the term patriotism, as well as real patriotic feelings, are used to mobilize the population for warfare or to entice them to lower their moral consciousness of atrocities committed by the members of our own armed forces against the population of a state or another political entity we are at war with. Examples could be US-Vietnam War or wars on the territory of the former Yugoslavia. Because of these historical circumstances, some citizens of the countries formed after the disintegration of the former Yugoslavia would feel uneasy in situations where they should identify themselves as patriots, or they would use these terms openly distancing themselves from nationalism. Although this definition of nationalism is too broad, since it covers everything, ranging from cheering for the national team of one's own country when it plays an international game, to calling for the protection of the interest of one's own nation, which implies military intervention, or even partial or complete physical extermination of members of another nation. Although it is too broad, it implies the use of the term nationalism in everyday ordinary language, and it may be better to retain it as a raw term with certain necessary specification rather than to construct a particular philosophical or social scientific meaning of that term while retaining the same expression. Aversion to foreigners can be expressed in the form of eye-rolling and unspoken indignation over their distinctive features, but also as open call for a ban of the further immigration of foreigners and cancellation of hospitality to those already present, including even deportation. Extreme examples of xenophobia would include actions for the physical liquidation of even one's own nationals, who are in some respect strangers, for example, in ethnic, religious, or cultural terms. In any case, the term xenophobia is coined with a critical intent and has a pejorative meaning. It does have a taste of something morally wrong. So the question, can xenophobia be ethically justified, would seem like a mere rhetorical question. Perhaps it should therefore be rephrased as, can aversion to foreigners be ethically justified? Of course, the question in which cases aversion to foreigners can be ethically justified would indicate in advance that he or she considers it justifiable in some situations. However, we are not interested in every form of aversion to foreigners, but whether the aversion to migrants and nationalism in relation to them can be ethically justified by appealing for the need to preserve one's own cultural identity. Granting foreigners the right to enter certain territories or denying that right is a state decision. It is based on certain security and economic estimates. No country wants to accept those who present a security risks. For example, the risk of terrorism or a deadly infectious disease. Most countries today want tourists or investors. We cannot discuss history here, especially from the Middle Ages in Europe, when foreigners who were endangered in domicile countries were protected. Modern states that publicly advocates for the application of some principle in the international organization of a country, internal organization of a country, obviously have some kind of moral obligation to provide protection to asylum seekers who are persecuted and threatened in their own countries for advocating for the same principle. A good example of this would be the rule of law or respect of human rights. Authorities of a democratic legal state may be concerned about the legitimacy in the eyes of its own citizens if they refuse to provide asylum to a supporter of the rule of law or human rights, or if they just let him go to the country where he or she is the subject to persecution. Regardless of the fact that human rights in some discourses have been transformed into the ideology of human rights, and the fact that this ideology is sometimes used to impose to some states, and especially the weak ones, certain political solutions, one should not lose sight of the fact that outside the North America continent and Europe, the rule of law and respect of human rights is often a matter of the privileged classes. One should not draw an analogy between rights of a state to deny entry into its territory to those who are not its citizens, and the right of the owner of a boat to deny boarding to those who he or she does not want on the boat. However, certain similarities cannot be overlooked. As the owner of a boat, you have at least a moral obligation to take a stranger into your boat if his or her stay outside the boat would threaten his or her life. Let us imagine that you and your family, including little children, found yourselves in a boat in the middle of the storm. There is no imminent danger of overturning the boat, but waves continue to pump water inside. Because of the amount of the water that filled the boat, it seems that it could sink. The water is very cold, and the sinking of the boat would be fatal to those on board. Near the boat in the water, there are about 30 people drowning. 2 or 3 of them might be able to get onto the boat without making it sink. They might even help get the water out of the boat. However, if all of the drowning people try to get onto the boat, it is obvious that it would immediately sink. I will not go into difficult question here, whether in case we still try to take 2 or 3 drowning people on the boat, we should give priority to those from our country over foreigners. Who should have priority if the drowning people are our relatives, neighbors, and friends? For an ethnic nationalist, compatriots are some sort of very distant relatives. I refer to these questions as they relate to the corpus of the problems discussed here. There are also questions that do not refer to this analogy, such as, is it morally justified to give priority to those drowning individuals we had previously met and who we found likable over those we had previously met and to whom we felt groundless aversion? Closer to this corpus of problems would be the question whether it is morally justified to give priority to those foreigners who come from countries that we consider traditionally friendly and allies, to foreigners who come from countries that we consider hostile or competitive. These questions are justified provided that all the drowning individuals are in more or less the same medical and physical conditions, that everyone has the same chance to survive once they are rescued from water, and that everyone can participate equally in drawing water out of the boat. The analogy with the boat is not tenable in the following important aspect. If all 30 drowning people try to get on the boat, it will overturn, and those who are now in the boat and those who try to enter it will die. In the case of settling a manifold large number of inhabitants in a state, not everybody will suffer. The standard of living of those already there will greatly decrease, but those who have entered, if they come from a state where there is famine, their standard of living will increase, but not in case of unlimited immigration. A complete unlimited settlement of a large number of inhabitants could mean a complete collapse of the rule of law and the destruction of a successful economy, which was the primary reason for immigration. But if this cause of migration is climate change, the inability to survive in areas where massive drought or uncontrolled floods have occurred, for those who struggle to survive, the standard of living will not be decisive. Do citizens of a state have the moral right, if they want to preserve their well-regulated society, to leave people fleeing from the affected areas in which it is not longer possible to organize life at the mercy of their destiny? Fleeing from the war-affected areas compared to mass migration of the population, which we are likely to expect in not so distant future because of climate change, is just a final rehearsal before the premiere or a final training before the main game. Perhaps with these kind of questions, it seems like getting ahead of ourselves. Let us focus on the issue of today's growing new nationalism in Europe and the United States. Every nationalism insists on the importance of preserving one's own cultural identity, so it has a conservative character. It does not imply the need to develop new cultural patterns and to expand and enrich what is taken from one's own tradition. Nationalism, as nationalism, is always conservative, even though its conservativeness betrays its own concept. Against its self-image, it never advocates the preservation of the traditional cultural identity, but only its certain aspects, while others are suppressed. Identitarian nationalism is directed against the poor foreigners. By refusing to assimilate, they, as the narrative of the identitarian nationalism states, change the character of the host culture in a bad, damaging way. Xenophobia and identitarian nationalism have no vigor in a situation where foreigners contribute to the economy. Tourists may be an example. Let us imagine a small place on the coast of any of the European seas that tourists come into during summer. They bring new and unusual customs, including even sunbathing. Only few of the older inhabitants in this place, most often those whose houses are more distant from the beach and where foreigners do not stay during holidays, would grumble occasionally against these strange foreigners who had never come here before. They would also point out that by returning year after year, foreigners have started to influence with their behavior the views and opinions of the local youth. This observation is not incorrect, but most of them do not see anything alarming at all. There is no moral panic, nor are there hostile feelings toward foreigners. The major part of the local population has financial benefits from them. After a number of years, the economic structure of this place would be altered to a great extension, and most people would live directly or indirectly during the year from the earnings they gain from tourists during the summer months. The place becomes a holiday resort. Not only its natural beauties, the sea, the beach, and the beautiful landscape, but also the traditional culture of this region, including architecture, culinary customs, musical heritage, everything is in the function of tourism. To be honest, different aspects of a traditional culture change more or less, but it does not bother anyone very much. Even the fact that some old customs have been turned into folklore offer for tourists. Xenophobia is barely present. I would rather say it is xenophilia that is evident. Perhaps it is not quite sincere, but it is clearly visible. Foreigners are forgiven even when they disrespect local customs and even break local laws. Nobody warns them, and smaller incidents are tolerated by the local population. Okay. The concern of an identitarian nationalist to preserve the cultural identity or his or her community is actually selfish concern for the preservation of resources of social solidarity and collective goods of a state whose user he or she could be. Thank you.
First of all, let me thank the organizers of this conference for the invitation. And to be honest, I must say that at first, when I received it, I was a bit surprised because I'm not working directly on these issues. But this invitation, given the status of the inviting institution and the other participants, were so flattering for me, so it was impossible to turn it down. So I decided to accept it and to try my best to give a contribution to its topic from the specific perspective that, given my background in philosophy, which is logic, argumentation theory, and recently philosophy of law, I could contribute a bit. So, as I said, the general theoretical platform from which I would try to approach this topic is this logical argumentative approach to legal reasoning, which is based on the general presupposition that the logical and argumentative correctness of the application of legal norms to factual reality is a necessary, although not sufficient, condition for protection of fundamental legal and societal values like justice, equality, dignity, etc. So this is some general standpoint that I adopt. And the relevance of this approach for the topic of the conference would be the attempt to show the complexity of normative mechanisms directed against harmful social practices like racism and xenophobia, especially in the application of general norms that protect those fundamental values. So the focus of my analysis would be the phenomenon of legal justification. In fact, the justification of judicial decisions, which in contemporary research in argumentation theory, and especially the argumentation theory related to legal reasoning, plays a really important role, because the general idea is that the acceptability of a legal thesis is dependent on the quality of the justification. For example, Evelyn Fetteris, one of the very prominent theoretician argumentation theorists who work on legal reasoning and argumentation, explicitly advanced this view, which means that the acceptability here is not related only to the parties involved, but also it is directed to wider social community and in specific cases to the higher legal instances. So which cases are most interesting for analysis from an argumentative and logical point of view? Cases in which the decision of collective judicial bodies are not unanimous. And this is the so-called hard cases, where it's necessary to include these several instances, and where all the problems of legal interpretation and all the difficulties and all the subtleties of this phenomenon comes into play. And so I will narrow down my approach to the status of a phenomenon which is very very interesting in contemporary and very widely researched in contemporary argumentation theory, especially related to legal reasoning, the phenomena of dissenting opinions in legal justification. These are the decisions that go against the majority decisions, and in some systems they are published together with the majority decisions. So they give the possibility to identify both reasons pro and contra the majority decision, And also, it was interesting to notice that in theory, there are divided opinions regarding the practice of making public these dissenting judicial opinions. Why? The adherents of the view that find that there are compelling reasons, or say strong reasons, if not compelling, to not make them public, is that they, in a way, undermine the image of consistency, completeness, and determinacy of the legal system. So they, in a way, are weakening the authority of the final majority decision, because it is obvious that there are not the universally obvious one right answer to this controversy, but there are always differing opinions. And if, for example, the play of forces in this judicial body were different, perhaps the decision would turn out completely the other way around. And also they, in a way, breach the secrecy of the deliberation, which is one of the important principles of this judicialism. However, on the other hand, there are pretty strong current that favors the opposite view, that there are stronger reasons to make them public, because they make possible to manifest the judicial integrity, independence, and the transparency of the process of decision making. Also, one of the pro-arguments in this controversy is the fact that dissenting opinions can also motivate the adherents of the majority opinion to elaborate a stronger and sharper version of their own arguments. And also, as a famous saying of Justice Charles Hughes from US Supreme Court reads, they're appealing to the intelligence of a future day. In some cases, they can really be the factors, powerful factors of normative change and evolution of the legal system in question, which is empirically confirmed by some famous dissenting opinions in cases of racial discrimination and segregation. I choose those examples from obvious reasons because they're directly relevant to the topic of the conference. For example, in the existing literature on this topic, there is virtually no text relevant for this topic, which does not mention those famous 19th century examples from the practice of US Supreme Court, in which Justice Curtis opposed the majority opinion that denied full citizenship of the descendants of African Americans brought to US as slaves. It was the famous case Dred Scott versus Sanford. And also Justice Harlan, which in also the famous complex of cases known as civil rights cases, was against the majority decision that supported racial segregation. So these were those famous dissenters who in that time were in the minority, but they contributed to really this global and important axiological and normative changes. So, because of the time constraint, I will try to narrow down my focus further and to shift to the contemporary context, not in a global sense, but I was also only focus of the practice of some aspects, of course, of the practice of the European Court of Human Rights, because in the contemporary European context, the pillars of non-discrimination law in Europe, amongst others, are the prohibition of discrimination provided in the Council of Europe's European Convention on Human Rights, as interpreted by the European Court of Human Rights, and the law of European Union as interpreted by the Court of Justice of the European Union. So, in the relevant documents, it is always emphasized that the importance of the principle of non-discrimination consists, among other reasons, in the fact that it influences the enjoyment of all other human rights. So it's not only one freestanding rights on its own, but also it affects the protection and the enjoyment of all other human rights. And that's why we can also read in the relevant legal
regularly, for example, in the protocols that are added to the basic form of the European Convention of Human Rights, that there are progressively strengthened condition for protection of this right to non-discrimination as a fundamental right that influence the protection of all other rights. So my research was focused on some selected cases from the jurisprudence of those two institutions, and also, although in my abstract I promised that I would make some comparative analysis, I saw that this was too ambitious a project for this occasion. So I will focus only on one case, like some kind of preliminary case study. As you can see here, we have numerous cases which virtually target most of the countries different countries from the jurisdiction of European Court of Human Rights, which is pretty large. But here I selected some cases that are more cited.
Sejdić, Finci, please.
Sejdić, here it is. Sejdić and Finci versus Bosnia and Herzegovina, right of minorities to stand in elections. Yeah. There, from a technical point of view, really this database of European Court of Human Rights, it's very, very useful because all the decisions, including dissenting opinions, of course, are easily accessible, and also the searching system really makes, because you can search by case, by country, by article, by minority or minority criterion of the decision, so it's really a gold mine for argumentation theorists, especially in the case of this judicial reasoning. So I thought that it would be ideal to find some relevant case which concerns Macedonia in order to make it possible to assess the larger context, but unfortunately, or fortunately, I didn't find a case that would satisfy all the criteria. That's why I decided to focus the attention on one case which is widely cited in the literature. So this is the main criterion. There are really a significant body of texts and commentaries and other argumentative analysis, and it is widely known as one of the landmark decisions of the European Court, DH and others versus the Czech Republic. So the applicants were Czech children of Roma descent between 9 and 15 years old who had been placed in special schools for children with mental disabilities between 1996 and 1999. The problem was that they were not unique because there was disproportionate classification of Roma school children as having special educational needs. In 1999, the probability of a Roma child of being assigned to a special school was more than 27 times higher than for a non-Roma child. So the argumentation of the applicants before the European Court was that they were victims of segregation based on race or ethnic origin, and that it represented a violation of their right to education, recognized in the famous Article 40 of the European Convention, which is a general prohibition of discrimination, or in connection with the Article 2 of the Protocol 1, connected to their right of education. So this is the content of the relevant articles. The fact of the case is that in 2006, almost 7 years after the initial complaint was lodged before the Strasbourg court, the chambers, so the first body that decided in this case, rejected it, but 6 voted to 1. So the chamber held that, among other things, the government has succeeded in establishing that the system of special schools in the Czech Republic was not introduced solely to cater to Roma children, and that the rules governing children's placement in special schools do not refer to the pupils' ethnic origin. So no basis for finding discrimination or violation of their right to education. For the court, this system of special schooling was established with the legitimate aim of adapting the educational system to the needs and aptitudes aptitudes or disabilities of children regardless of their ethnic origin. So, additional argument of the court, of the chamber was that the applicant's parents failed to take any action against placing their children in a special school. However, this ruling was followed by one dissenting opinion, Judge Barreto, which was based on the following arguments. First, Czech government has previously conceded that Romani children with average or above average intellect were often placed in special schools on the basis of results of psychological tests, the tests which were conceived for the majority population and did not take Romani specifics into consideration. So, in some special schools, Romani pupils made up between 80 and 90 of the total number, so significant, I mean statistically disproportionately large number, and taken together, these concessions amounted to an express acknowledgement of the Czech state of the discriminatory practices complained of by the applicants. This is the only dissenting opinion in which we can see the arguments that go against the majority opinion. And also, there was another separate opinion, which was generally concurring, but only after some hesitation. And in this second opinion, there was one concern expressed that I quote. This is Judge Costa, which was the president of the body that decided in the first instance. The danger is that under cover of psychological or intellectual tests, virtually an entire socially disadvantaged section of the school population finds itself condemned to low-level schools with little opportunity to mix with children of other origins and without any hope of securing an education that will permit them to progress. So, after this decision was object of an appeal by the applicants to the decision of the chamber, and in 2007, the Grand Chamber of the European Court reversed the decision. So, the Grand Chamber ruled in the favor of the applicants and held that there had been indirect discrimination against the applicants in the context of education, finding a violation of Article 14, read in conjunction with Article 2 of the Protocol 1. So, recognizing the Roma as a vulnerable minority requiring special protection, the court held that it was not, I quote, satisfied that the difference in treatment between Roma children and non-Roma children was objectively and reasonably justified, and that there existed a reasonable relationship of proportionality between the means used and the aim pursued. So, in the literature on the case, there are several important aspects that I think are particularly important for our topic and also appeal for further analysis. So the first is the introducing of the concept of indirect discrimination. So on the top of direct discrimination, which is more easily identifiable, this ruling of the court was breaking the path into recognizing also other more subtle but not less destructive practices of indirect discrimination, when an apparently neutral rule, in this case the testing and evaluating method, disadvantages a person or a group sharing the same characteristics. So it was not, according to this new, strengthened practice of protection against discrimination, it was not sufficient for the state to prove that there were not intention to discriminate, but the very existence of the effect, of the practical effect of discrimination was enough to find it, say, guilty for violating the relevant articles. The second, the second and the third are very important from my point of view, because from an argumentative point of view, they make some changes in the procedure, some procedural intervention that shows that in this delicate area of establishing indirect discrimination, it is not enough to apply just general procedural and argumentative rule. For example, admissibility of statistical evidence. So, with this ruling and with some succeeding cases, it is established that statistical data can play an important role in helping a claimant give rise to a presumption of discrimination. So it is not mandatory to appeal to statistical evidence. It is not in every case just admissible just like that, but in some cases can play an important role in raising a presumption of discrimination. And the second one, which is very fundamental for legal procedures, is the effect of shifting the burden of proof. So it is not required from the plaintiff to give complete and conclusive evidence that there is a violation, because in such cases the necessary evidence is already is mainly in the hand of the respondent state. And so, once the person alleging discrimination established a presumption of discrimination or prima facie discrimination, the burden then shifts to the defendant, the respondent state, which has to show that the difference in treatment is not discriminatory. So, in fact, to show either there is no difference in treatment, or when there is discriminatory treatment, this is, differential treatment, it is not discriminatory, but justified by legitimate aim or proportion. Also, this new ruling of the Grand Chamber introduced addressing the structural arrangement and institutional practices that violate the human rights of racial or ethnic groups, and thus allowing not only complaints not only against individual acts of discrimination against individuals. So this concept of structural violence, which is rather indirect, was taken into consideration. And also another important effect of this ruling, that there can be no waiver of the right not to be subjected to racial discrimination, because according to the court, even that in these cases exists the parents' consent to place their children in those low-level special schools, it is not enough to just waiver the right of the applicants, because here the court insisted on the necessity of informed consent and lack of indirect constraints. So the parents' waiver of the right of the children not to be put in those schools was not counted as enough. So how much time do we have?
It's 20 minutes already.
Okay,
jump to conclusion.
So I will jump to conclusion. Just to review the other slides, because I think that now the story has an interesting turn, that the decision of the Grand Chamber was not unanimous, and now 4 out of 17 judges vote against the decision and file dissenting opinions. So now the situation reversed, and I was very interested to see what kinds of arguments are those dissenting judges now adducing, but because of the time constraint, I will just not enter into their analysis. I summarized 4 arguments. So double standard in assessing different states, so that this treatment had legitimate aim of the difference in treatment, compulsory education for all children, fighting racism with racism, that treating Roma parents as systematically incapable of making decisions regarding those their children was another form of racism, and reinterpreting the sense of the expression persons in otherwise similar situation, because one of the judges pleaded that there were no difference in treatment between children attending the same special school with children Roma and non-Roma are to be considered as persons in otherwise similar situation. So that the argument is that in this case, the sense of the expression persons in otherwise similar situation should not be applied to Roma children in special school with non-Roma children in non-special school, but with children in same special school. So the social reception of this decision was very interesting because at first there were very negative public reaction to the first chamber's decision, which was described as conservative and formalistic, and while the latter Grand Chamber's ruling was described as remarkable reversal, and it became an object of wide academic and social interest and an important reference in the context of non-discrimination law, and also was referred to as important sources in other post-DH cases on similar problematic. For example, Sampani said other versus Greece, or Orsush and other versus Croatia, which also had some interesting aspects regarding those dissenting opinions. And so, instead of conclusion, this one of the aspects of this case study, I would like to use it as an argument in favor of my personal taking part in this controversy, whether to publish or not to publish the dissenting opinions. I'm pro publishing the dissenting opinion in this controversy, yes, because they contribute to sharpening and enriching the argumentative structure of legal justification. And dissenting opinions may significantly influence the normative evolution of the legal area in question, inspiring remarkable reversals, as in this case and the other cited cases. They also reflect differences in underlying legal ideologies and different prioritizing of legal and societal values by individual judges, thus showing the axiological complexity of legal reasoning. And also they articulate reasons and arguments which, whether accepted or not, are useful for better preparing the argumentative terrain for the treatment of other similar cases in future. And to quote again this famous saying, that their appeal to the intelligence of the future day is also an important aspect which makes us possible to get better insight into this dynamic of stability and change that is also characteristic not only for society in general, but especially for the evolution of normative systems. Thank you.
Yes, well, that makes it awkward for me now, but I'll do my best. Thank you for having me, first of all. Politics and the poetic function of language may seem to make strange bedfellows, but I think it should be patent that any study of ideology cannot be dissociated from the issues of language. In fact, I would like to quote here in a preliminary fashion something from a book by Rastko Močnik on the relation between art and ideology. Art is not based on its ideological basis because this basis is of its own devising entirely. In other words, this is Močnik still, material basis of art is ideology as signifying mechanism. It's something that means, but it's not relevant for this purpose what it means. In fact, it doesn't mean anything, but it has a lot of sense. In other words, the language used in art is the language of ideology, but it is precisely here that ideology is not identical to itself. This makes it possible for Sartre, for example, to claim that fascist novel is an impossibility, or a racist novel is an impossibility. Because fascism, if it's anything, is this being identical to itself, being at one with itself, which precisely here is not the case. Now, apart from these two works by Giorgio Agamben, Meci senza fine, Means Without Ends, and Derrida, Monolinguisme de l'autre, Monolingualism of the other, I could have, I think, drawn on the work of Jacques Rancière on the Partage de Sensible, on Bernard Stiegler on Misère symbolique, on Lyotard on Le Différent, and the way he discusses the language games. All of these authors, I think, show that the study of language is a very political issue. And I will try to show this briefly. All forms of nationalism, old and new, have in common one thing, and that is the issue of identity. In Monolinguisme de l'autre, Derrida discusses his own exemplary experience, which he thinks is exemplary precisely because he was denied the status of being an exemplar of anything. He was denied his French citizenship under German occupation, which made him a person that without any kind of identity or any affiliation. The crucial point for Derrida is his relationship to the French language, which was also denied him, because he says, I had no other language to fall back upon when this was taken from me. Technically, of course, he was a Jew from Algeria, but he knew very little Arabic and no Hebrew. So French language and the French identity and the French culture, which were denied him by the German occupation, even though no German soldier ever set foot in Algeria. He was deprived of what he calls the absolute habitat, his language. Now, from this, he moves to the crucial central claim of the book, and that is that one always speaks a language that is not one's own. I have only one language, and it is not mine. We only ever speak one language. We never speak only one language. This is closely related to the problem, what he calls the foolish problems of identity, when they are dogmatically presupposed in various relations of belonging by virtue of birth, language, culture, nationality, or citizenship, whether in multicultural or monocultural contexts. For example, with respect to belonging by virtue of birth, Derrida thinks that it would be much better to think of belonging by virtue of death, because one certainly cannot choose where one is born. To a certain extent, or some people can choose where they die. So there is more of one's own will involved in this process. At any rate, what Derrida is concerned here and elsewhere with is what he terms trouble d'identité, the certain upheaval in the identity. And of course, this is closely related to the poetical function of language, the way language is treated in poetical works. Identity, of course, is not to be denied. The thing is not to reify it, or, as Derrida puts it, not to naturalize it or renaturalize it. My language, this is Derrida again, the only one I have I hear myself speak and agree to speak is the language of the other. And this goes for every language, not just for Algerian Jews of Derrida's generation. The point that Derrida is emphatic about is that there is no natural property of language. And this, I think, brings him in close affinity with Agamben, and Agamben's, one of Agamben's main principal tenets about human beings being defined as Homo sapiens loquendi. Not just Homo sapiens, but Homo sapiens loquendi. The humans know that they speak. The knowledge of speech is essential. Other beings can communicate, but they don't have this knowledge because they don't have to learn. This condition of having to learn the language is what Agamben calls infancy, which of course also means childhood, but the Latin term is derived from he who cannot speak. Infans is he who is deprived of speech. And this is also discussed by Blanchot and Lyotard. So having to learn to speak is closely related to all the entire complex of problems of origin and essence and presence, not to mention the ambiguity of the very notion of identity, whether we are dealing with the identity in the sense of idem or in the sense of ipse. Also, it has, many of these issues have already been raised in previous talks. One of them is the notion of return, what the Greeks called the nostos. So the return, whether the return is possible, or where is it that one returns to, and how can one know? The point, at any rate, of Derrida's argument is that identity of any kind is never given, received, or attained. But it's what we have instead is a continual process of identification, which is incessant, and so identity in that sense can never be achieved. Which is why he can say of himself that he is more and less French than any other Frenchman, more and less Jewish than any other Jew, more or less Franco-Maghrebian than any other Franco-Maghrebian, and so on. In short, he is never at one with himself. His identity is never his own, but still this identity obtains, this relation obtains. He describes this relation as neurotic. He even defines himself with respect to the French language as the last defender and illustrator of the French language, insisting that he never has any intention of harming or injuring the French language. But at the same time, insisting that language must always be innovated, rejuvenated, made new. And this brings him to another of his favorite topics, which is the issue of translation and the whether anything at all can or cannot be translated. And then, of course, he says here as elsewhere that nothing is untranslatable, and on the other hand, everything is untranslatable. The point that he makes here, in a humorous fashion, is compatriots of every country, translator, poets, rebel against patriotism. He urges the speakers of a language, the members of a culture, the members of a nation, not to identify themselves with that culture, that language, that nation. This is again something that is very usefully formulated by Ratko Močnik in this book I've mentioned earlier. The relationship, this very Derridian formulation of the status of language. Nothing is outside language, but language is incomplete. Language is insufficient. It's not whole. This is not unrelated to the issue of modernity, as we've already had the occasion to hear. Specifically, the way it is articulated by Philippe Lacoue-Labarthe when he says that modernity, and Jean-Luc Nancy, when they oppose this to the Nazi myth, to the incessant repetition of the same. To live in myth is to live in quotation. Now, modernity is the opposite of this, the opposite of incessant repetition. It's a constant urge to innovate. However that may be, the originary alienation, as Derrida calls it, means that every language is the language of the other, as I've already said, that it is impossible to possess a language, whereas all the ideologies of nationalist stripe, or as Derrida calls them, nationalist aggression, are naturalist in a sense that they insist precisely on this possession, having taken possession or being possessed by this essence. In other words, ideology is a matter of appropriation. It is not natural, no matter how strong this impulse to renaturalize. In fact, Derrida urges us to cut to the quick this idea of naturalized fictions. But on the other hand, and this is a more complex part of his book, on the other hand, however, and I will have to skip this, he also says that all culture is colonial. And this is he then exemplifies this by his relation to French as a political colonial force in Algeria on the one hand, and his attitude towards the French language and the French culture, literature in particular. These two are never to be conflated for Derrida. French culture, French literature is one thing, French colonial politics is something else entirely. And Agamben's short but cogent analysis of the notion of people and language is, I think, entirely consonant with this argument. First, Agamben elsewhere notices that the word people is ambiguous insofar as, on the one hand, it refers to a constitutive political subject. On the other hand, it refers precisely to those who are excluded from that sphere, so the people. Now, Agamben's argument is that all peoples are gangs or coquilles. Coquille was a word for gypsy gangs in the Middle Ages. And that all languages are jargons, secret languages, such as the language of medieval gypsies. Argot, or jargon, is not a language, just as gypsies are not a people. But, Agamben demonstrates that, in fact, the only thing that we can actually deal with direct or prove is the factum loquendi and the factum pluralitatis. Namely, that there is only the fact of speech and the fact of people gathering, of plurality being there. These are both unexplained and inexplicable occurrences. In spite of the fact that political theory and discourse of politics is founded on the attempt to clarify something obscure, the concept of people, by means of something even more obscure. These are Agamben's words, the concept of language. If we accept this thesis, and Agamben strictly specifies that he is not interested in its scientific validity, but in its liberating potential, then Agamben says the perverse and tenacious machines that hold sway in our political imaginary will be undermined. Now, what this means is that the modern state is the custodian and expression of the people. This is how it styles itself, and this is what it's taken to be. Whereas Agamben shows the idea of the people never had any real content. It is but an empty support of state identity. In contrast, the concept of the people is meaningful only if it is recodified as citizenship. The vicious entanglement of language, people, and state, Agamben says, and then discusses this example briefly, is clearly seen in the case of Zionism. But I will skip this now. And then he perhaps unexpectedly moves to Dante's thesis of the Vulgare Illustre, and says, Agamben says that contrary to popular and prevalent interpretations of Dante, his position is not that the grammatical rules of a national language should be imposed on the speech, but that a transformation of the very experience of speech is the key to political action. The political and the poetical, as Agamben says, not merely linguistic and literary. And in conclusion, I had
a question for organizer. Are we going to have a discussion before the lunch, or yes? Okay.
Yeah.
So
now,
very briefly.
Yeah.
Okay. Sentences.
Yes. So basically, that is the principal argument. There was another part that deals with Derrida's reading of Carl Schmitt in Politics of Friendship, which is closely related to this by virtue of the untenable difference on which Schmidt insists between polemos and stasis, the pure war or war proper and civil war, one being war with the external, the other with internal enemy, and then Derrida shows that this distinction, this crucial difference cannot in fact be maintained, and Schmidt is forced to admit finally that his attempt to purify politics conceptually, to offer, because he is discussing the work that is called the concept of the political, in fact collapses under its own weight back into the political. That the notion of political, all notions that have to do with politics can only be political and polemical, that they cannot be conceptually rigorous. At any rate, all of this should be considered or taken as conceptual or theoretical, if you like, starting point for a political engagement. A political engagement is impossible without taking into account the poetical. Merely political will lead into fascism for a variety of reasons that we've already heard earlier, but I think also because of this. Because of the nature of language use that is peculiar to fascism and the ways in which it can be combated.